House. They also gave substantial funding and support to James Dobson and his focus on the Family Prayer Warrior Network. Eric Prince's sister, Betsy, married Dick DeVos, who ran for governor in the state of Michigan recently and lost to Jennifer Granholm. Of course, he ran as a Republican. Dick DeVos was the heir to the Amway Corporation fortune. Amway was the single greatest bankroller of the Republican Revolution. Many say it was a company that was run by like a cult that used its marketing team spread out across the country as a sort of political engine to try to overthrow what they saw as secularist politicians in the United States. And so these two families, the DeVos family and the Prince family, they merged together when Betsy Prince married Dick DeVos. And they merged in the kind of marriage that was commonplace in the monarchies of old Europe. And together they formed a formidable, behind-the-scenes power player in radical right-wing politics in this country. Eric Prince was an early intern at George H.W. Bush's White House, but he complained that it wasn't conservative enough for him. On gay issues, on the budget, on the environment were the three issues that he cited. He also was an intern for Dana Rohrabacher, one of the biggest lunatics in the Congress. Dana Rohrabacher was an advisor to Ronald Reagan and was a senior speechwriter for Reagan. Rohrabacher gets elected to Congress after leaving the Reagan White House, and in the 3 months between the election and the beginning of his term, he flies over to Afghanistan to fight on the side of the Mujahideen against the Soviets and continues to brag about this. These were the people that peppered the landscape of young Eric Prince's upbringing, the man who would go on to found Blackwater. Now, in 1995, Eric Prince had been in the Navy SEALs for a number of years. It had been his dream to be in the U.S. military, and he had deployments in Bosnia, in Haiti, in the Mediterranean. But in 95, his father died suddenly of a heart attack in the elevator of the family business, and Eric Prince's young wife had cancer, and he goes back to Michigan to help the family sort through the business. And at the funeral of Edgar Prince, the two main eulogies for him given were by Bauer and Dobson. And they came and they talked about how Edgar Prince stepped in at a moment when the Supreme Court was trying to make abortion the law of the land, and came in at a crucial moment and was the major fundraiser and the fund provider for the organizations that now make up the religious right in this country. So Eric Prince sits down with his family after his father's death, and they try to decide what to do with the family business, and ultimately after deliberation they decide to sell it for $1.3 billion in cash. They sold it to Johnson Controls. Johnson Controls sent the jobs out of the country. And the Prince family divides up the money. Eric Prince then goes out to North Carolina, teams up with a small group of other guys that he had met in the Special Forces, and together they begin building what would be called Blackwater Lodge and Training Center. At the beginning, it was nothing more than about 5,000 acres of land spread over 2 counties in North Carolina, and the vision of Eric Prince. They began to build up that company, and they incorporated it in late '96. They build it up through '97. It's a fairly quiet time. In '98, they have their grand opening, and there are 2 special congressional guests. Dana Rohrabacher is flown out for the grand opening, and John Doolittle, another right-wing, very right-wing Republican congressman from California. And their reason for being at Blackwater's grand opening in the literature at the time was that they were staunch defenders of the Second Amendment. And so the original concept of Blackwater, by all accounts, had nothing to do with providing mercenary services. It was supposed to be Blackwater Lodge and Training Center. And the idea was it was going to be a sportsman's paradise, a place where gun enthusiasts could come and fire off their weapons. But then early literature of the company also indicated that they intended to take advantage of what they saw as the coming accelerated government outsourcing of security and firearms-related training. And in 1998, Blackwater had not much business at all. But then in 1999, the first of what would be almost annual tragedies that would end up benefiting Blackwater would take place, and that was the Columbine shootings in April of 1999. Blackwater responded to Columbine by erecting a mock high school on their compound on the Great Dismal Swamp of North Carolina, and they called it Are You Ready High, like the letter R, letter U, Are You Ready High. And they invited law enforcement agents from around the country to come to Moyock, North Carolina at Blackwater and train in how to face down against the violent youth of America. In fact, recently they've been talking about how Blackwater could have been helpful in the Virginia Tech shootings. Yeah. So then the next year, the next tragedy that would take place would be the bombing of the USS Cole off the coast of Yemen. Many of you probably remember that. It was portrayed at the time as one of the worst so-called peacetime attacks. Tell the people of Iraq living under sanctions it was peacetime. One of the worst peacetime attacks against a U.S. vessel in recent history. And the Navy responded to that attack, which killed a number of sailors, by awarding Blackwater a $35.7 million contract to train sailors in how to face down against attacks against their vessels or their ships. In 2000, Blackwater was given its federal vending license by the Clinton administration. Anyone who thinks that the problems of the world began with Bush is incredibly naive. You can erase 9/11 from the equation, and you have a solid trajectory that goes from Reagan to Bush to Clinton to Bush, and that's been the case with Blackwater too. The Clinton administration awards Blackwater its federal vending license, and one former CIA operative told us for the book, once you get that license, it's like you enter the Walmart of government shopping. It gives you permission to market your goods and services to any agency of the federal government. And so, a lot of us talk about money and politics, but it's a fascinating window into how this works. You get the permission to be a vendor, and then the game becomes, who do you know and how well do you grease the wheels? And that's where, when we fast forward to the Bush administration, we look at Blackwater making an enormous amount of money. So under Clinton, they're given this federal vending license. At the beginning, the federal government estimated that Blackwater was going to gross about $125,000 over 5 years. By the time 6 years had elapsed, they'd grossed over $100 million. And one spokesperson for the government said to me, well, they were incredibly good at marketing their services. But in 2001 was when the crucial event happened that would make Blackwater's fate incredibly profitable. And that was, of course, 9/11. Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, he doesn't hold press conferences. He's very rarely interviewed. He recently wrote an op-ed that I'm going to talk about in a little while. But he did make one television appearance right after 9/11, and you might be able to guess the network he appeared on. Fox News. You might be able to guess the show. O'Reilly Factor. So Eric Prince is on the O'Reilly Factor, and he was talking about the Federal Air Marshal Program. And at the time there was this debate, should we have armed marshals on every flight, etc. But Prince also said something that was fascinating. He said on that program, I was starting to get a little cynical about how seriously people took the business of security and training. Now, Eric Prince said, the phone is ringing off the hook. One of the early calls that came into Blackwater was from the Central Intelligence Agency, which contracted Eric Prince's men to send a small team of Special Forces operators inside of Afghanistan during the early stages of U.S. operations there. They positioned themselves near a CIA outpost in Shkin, near the border with Pakistan. Eric Prince himself went over with that Blackwater team. That, to my knowledge, is the first time that we see Blackwater crossing the line from being the sportsman's paradise and a training facility to being an all-out mercenary force. But the real serious money for Blackwater wouldn't start pouring in until U.S. tanks rolled into Baghdad in March of 2003. When the U.S. began occupying Iraq, the Bush administration deployed the largest army of private personnel ever deployed in a modern war zone, alongside the official occupation force. During the 1991 so-called Gulf War, you had a ratio of 60 soldiers to every one contractor. Right now, we're almost at a 1-to-1 ratio. This is not some accident of history. This was an intentional plan that was set in motion in 1993 when Dick Cheney was the Defense Secretary under George H.W. Bush. He commissioned a division of Halliburton, the company he would go on to head, to do a study on how to privatize the military bureaucracy. That accelerated the use of the logistical civilian program known as LOGCAP. So KBR is the biggest LOGCAP contractor now in Iraq. The Clinton administration picked up Cheney's ball. While Cheney was heading Halliburton, Clinton was accelerating the privatization of the military and the national security apparatus of the United States. And Cheney was heading Halliburton and hanging out at the American Enterprise Institute, and Rumsfeld was at the American Enterprise Institute, and they were pressuring, as it was portrayed in the press, pressuring Clinton to sign the Iraq Liberation Act, and of course he did that. And so you see that trajectory. This wasn't something that Bush invented. This was something that was bipartisan. And so when the tanks roll in, they have this army almost 1-to-1 of contractors to soldiers. And they send in a neoconservative / neoliberal quote-unquote terror expert. Of course it takes one to know one, Paul Bremer, who hits the ground in Iraq with it appeared to be the sole objective of destroying the country, destroying its economy, destroying the military, destroying civil society in Iraq, and creating bedlam and chaos. So Bremer hits the ground. He, of course, had worked for Henry Kissinger, one of the biggest terrorists in the world, and he hits the ground running in Iraq. But instead of the U.S. military protecting Paul Bremer, they give a no-bid contract to a private mercenary company for $27 million, and that company was Blackwater USA. So Blackwater would be charged with the all-important job of keeping the most hated man in Iraq alive during his time there. One of the earliest things that Paul Bremer did was to institute, and veterans know the consequences of this, Bremer instituted a disastrous policy known as de-Baathification. They were so intent on making this comparison between Saddam Hussein and Hitler, denazification, de-Baathification. And it all sounds, it sounds like one could make an argument that it made sense. You're just going to take out Saddam Hussein's top cadre of people and then, and punish them and put them on trial. No, what de-Baathification meant was that nurses, engineers, teachers, all of these people who had any loose affiliation with the Ba'ath Party. I spent a lot of time in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It was very difficult to find someone who had not, at some point or another in life, been forced to sign some kind of paper supporting the Ba'ath Party. They fired hundreds of thousands of workers who were simple civilians who were going about their daily lives. They fired people from the Ministry of Education. They fired the people who were in charge of reconstruction projects in the country. But also they fired 250,000 Iraqi soldiers. From one day to the next, they stopped paying them. We quote one senior U.S. official in the book as saying that it was the day we made 250,000 armed enemies in Iraq. Some of the leaders of the Iraqi military marched on the gates of the Green Zone and they said, this is a disaster. You can't stop paying our men. They'll all join the ranks of the resistance and rise up against you. Of course, no one listens. And so we saw a direct escalation in the attacks against U.S. forces that occurred right after the de-Baathification policies were implemented. And so as Bremer is running around earning himself nicknames like Little Saddam and Saddam after Saddam, it's Blackwater that's protecting him and keeping him alive. And in fact, when Bremer skulked out of Baghdad after a year in the country, he handed over sovereignty to an Iraqi government, and then he gave a thank you gift to Blackwater and other contractors, as they're called, the 130,000 Shadow Army in Iraq. He issued an edict known as Order 17, which granted sweeping immunity to all contractors from prosecution in Iraqi courts. That's a strange definition of sovereignty. And so Bremer leaves the country. And if you think about the psychology of a private company guarding Bremer versus the U.S. military, it goes something like this. If the military is guarding Paul Bremer or Zalmay Khalilzad or John Negroponte, and they get killed, there will be an investigation. It'll be a scandal. Maybe there will be a court-martial if they figure out that someone did something really outrageous. But nothing much is going to come of it. There's not going to be high-stakes consequences for the military. But if a private company loses Paul Bremer, it would wipe out their